Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Edenton Town Council Committee meeting for the month of November. We have agendas in the back if you'd like to follow along. Tonight we'll be meeting with three of our committees: Utilities, Administrative, and Finance. And so we'll start the evening off with Utilities Committee, and that meeting will be chaired by Councilman Bob Quinn.
Thank you, Mayor. We're fortunate this evening to have with us members of the Edenton Company that are here to present a water treatment system, an improvement program, give us a report on that. It's a long-range plan, and we're fortunate to have Bucky Moore, Gary Hartog, and Carl Sharp with us this evening. So, turn it over to you, gentlemen.
Adjust my microphone.
Thank you.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. Again, my name is Gary Hartong. I work out of our Greenville office, and objective tonight, as Councilman Quinn mentioned to you, is to bring you up to speed on a long-range water supply and treatment study that we have been working with the town on for several years now. And I'll spend just about 2 minutes just bringing you back up to speed. I know I've been in front of the council several times about this project, and we're at a point now that we've got some alternatives that we've analyzed and some recommendations for you. But I want to spend a minute, since it has been several years, just to get us back up to speed. Back in 2000, well, from the late 90s into the early 2000s, the town was experiencing a lot of development pressure. And from that, there was an increase in your water demand, and from that, there was some increased pressure on your wells. And so in the early 2000s, there were some well difficulties and some minor things happening at the water treatment plant, which we were contracted to assist the town with. At that time, about 2003, we did a small preliminary engineering report where we made some recommendations. One of those recommendations was to start looking at alternate water supplies. And Groundwater Management Associates, also out of Greenville, started working with us to identify some potential new well locations throughout town to not only get more water, but water with some better initial quality. In 2007, the town submitted a Rural Center grant application, and they obtained a planning grant to really do the desktop piece of that project. Now, there was also a field piece where the work that was to be done by GMA, including the drilling of some test wells. Those test wells, the construction of those was about $250,000. So if you remember 2007, economic downturn, the town did not have the cash on hand to go ahead and pay for those test wells. We looked back to the Rural Center for that money. They did not have it. We also looked to the SRF program and USDA, and there were certain restrictions there that didn't allow the town to come by those test well funds easily. Because of the cost of those funds and the ongoing project, we decided to refocus the project. Instead of concentrating on the test wells, we said, okay, well, let's assume that we can find those wells and we can find good water quality, and let's look at some options just on the treatment side, on the supply and treatment side, and let's look at what those different alternatives could be for replacing existing equipment or doing something a little bit different. So back in 2013, we reapproached the Rural Center. We said, hey, this is our new game plan. We want to shift the funds, reduce the local match. There was a lot of back and forth between the Rural Center, the town, and us, and we finally got them to agree to really reduce the scope and focus on this project. And so what we want to do tonight is review those findings with the council. There's no action to be taken tonight. At a follow-up meeting, the Rural Center will require the town to acknowledge the report that it is complete. We did present our findings, but there's no action needed this evening. Not going to spend much time this evening talking about your existing water treatment plants and your current water quality. That's really, that information is already included in the report, which we have provided copies to the town, electronic and print, if you'd like to read more about that. But instead, we really want to focus on the 4 strategies that we looked at to help the town meet its long-term needs. 2 of those alternatives include upgrading equipment and maintaining the existing water quality, which I will mention is in compliance with the state's primary drinking water quality standards. The other 2 alternatives, alternatives 3 and 4, those involve adding new treatment equipment and new wells to improve the taste and clarity of the water so that it meets, in addition to meeting the primary standards, it also meets the secondary water quality standards. So without further ado, I'll introduce Carl Scharf. Carl is a senior project engineer in our Raleigh office who did the majority of the work on the project.
Thank you, Gary. Can everybody hear me okay? Got to get close to that microphone. As Gary mentioned, I'm going to do a summary here of the report. It's a detailed report. If you want to get more details on it later, you can refer back to the report. What I want to hit primarily tonight is to describe quickly what was in that report. And so to start off, the purpose of this report, as Gary mentioned, you're seeing some saltwater intrusion into your aquifer system, which is resulting in a little more saltiness in your water, and again in the taste issues. And the town's existing treatment plant is based to remove hardness out of your water and to also chlorinate and add some polyphosphate to keep corrosion down. But it's not really, there's no treatment right now actually to take out the saltiness in the water. And the main point here was to evaluate feasible alternatives that will address the current and future needs in terms of water quality and reliability. That's kind of where we're headed with this. Right now you have four water supply wells and 2 water treatment plants. There's a Virginia well and the Freemason well. They feed the Freemason wastewater treatment plant kind of in the central and eastern part of town. And then Beaver Hill and Boswell wells, they feed the Beaver Hill wastewater treatment plant. There'll be a map I'll show in a minute showing you where these are. There's 2 elevated tanks at this point in town. And the PR, and as Gary mentioned, we were focusing more on the treatment aspects on the wells and the wastewater and the water treatment plants. So this is a diagram showing the different parts of the existing water system. See if I can get this red pointer going here. So right here you see there's a Virginia well here, and there's a Freemason wastewater treatment plant and a well at this point in the town. So the water is pumped from these 2 wells into the water treatment plant here and then distributed in this piping network. The other treatment plant is the Beaver Hill water treatment plant and well. I got to get this out of my head here, the water side here. And that particular plant receives water pumped from the Beaver Hill well and from the Boswell well over here. Pumped to this, it's treated here, and then distributed out to the distribution network. There's some larger 12-inch lines connecting the two water elevated tanks, which are helpful in the system. This is a quick view of the wastewater treatment plant schematic. What happens is you have your 2 wells that pump water into what's called an aerator, and the purpose of this aerator is you have some iron in your water, and the idea is to run the water through an aerator, basically fan that blows air through this aerator unit. The water flows down, and then it drops down into a concrete tank. And the idea here is to try to oxidize some of the iron that's in the well water. From here, in addition, if there's any kind of any kind of other contaminants that may air off, they can do it here. But it's primarily iron removal, and it goes to a reservoir, a raw water reservoir, they call it. And from here, there's high pressure pumps that pump the water to the softening unit.
Carl, one quick question. So in that first process,
The aerator process.
the aerator process, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit blurred, so I couldn't read, but there is no way through the aerator process, and I heard you say earlier, we can't remove salt, but through there's no way we can, in that process, to start with, remove salt. Is that correct?
No,
No way.
Yeah, there's not a method to do that for salt
Okay.
removal.
Okay.
I mean, if anything, you might evaporate some water off and concentrate a little more. No, that's not a salt removal process at all. What happens is you pump the water from the raw reservoir and it goes through the softener. The softener, what it does is remove hardness. It removes your calcium and your magnesium, and it replaces the calcium and magnesium with sodium, kind of like your home softeners. And then it's pumped out. The pressure from this pump pumps it through the softener and also gets the pressure into the distribution system to pump it to your tanks and in the rest of your system. So these pumps do that. There's a waste stream from this. Periodically, they have to, they call regenerate these softeners, and you run a salt solution back through it to take off the calcium hardness that you were taking off in the raw water, and then that water is discharged to a creek, to a small creek outside of each of the plants, and that has an NPDES discharge permit associated with that. Then you have polyphosphate added for corrosion control, and then you have your chlorine gas added for to kill any bacteria that are in the water and to maintain a residual in your system. Both of these plants are almost identical. They're both installed in the 1950s. So as part of our PER, what we do in this thing is we say, okay, well, we're looking at the 20-year, we're looking at the long-term aspect of things. We're looking at 20 years ahead. So we want to first get an idea of what kind of population are you going to have in the future so that we can meet that population need with your future water system. So as part of the PER, we went ahead and did that, and you know, the census data indicates that there hasn't been a whole lot of growth you know, in Edenton in the last decade, but we work with city staff to look at particular developments that we saw that were reasonable to assume we're going to develop over time, and these are listed on this table. The bottom line is that, whoops, hit the wrong button there. Giving you a preview here ahead of time, you know. The bottom line is that we thought it was reasonable to be about 12 units added to the town per year for planning purposes, for the 20-year planning purpose. And based on the current census data, you have about 2.31 people. I'm not sure how you get 0.31 people in the house, but anyhow, that's how it averages out, and that turns out to be about 28 people per year. We're also aware of two industries that have recently asked for an allocation of water in the future, and those were added into these estimates. So using those population estimates, then you go and you estimate what the water demands are going to be for the next 20 years. The way we did that is you look at what is your water use now, basically per person or per connection. In this case, I looked at per person, and it's roughly 100 gallons per day per person is what's used by your typical user right now. The maximum daily demand is twice that average daily demand. The ADD stands for average daily demand, and MDD for maximum daily demand. So we use the population growth of that 28 people per year, plus the industrial demand to come up with this table showing the future demand from 2015 up to 2035. And the bottom line on this is that your design ADD is 0.632, and then the maximum daily demand design value is 1.26. It's about twice, so your maximum daily demand is about twice what your average is over here. So then, as Gary mentioned, we looked at a couple different categories of alternatives. One was to continue with your existing water quality. As Gary said, you're meeting your primary drinking water standards at the moment. You've been doing that for a long time, and there's no major concerns there. The secondary drinking water standards are for what's called TDS, and chlorides and iron. TDS is kind of it's a measure of the saltiness, and chlorides is a measure of the chloride levels in the water. And the idea in the first two alternatives was to keep with your existing status quo in terms of your water quality, and that's replace existing equipment or do other things. And then there's meeting secondary drinking water standards is to improve the treatment to remove the saltiness that's in the water. So we developed 4 alternatives, and those are all listed in the PER, but alternative 1 was to upgrade both water treatment plants and then add a new well. The well that would be replaced would be the Freemason well. That's probably the well with the most saltiness in it right now, and so that would be the one that you'd focus on in this alternative to replace. We have a new groundwater well, and that would replace the Freemason well. We'd have a new 10-inch transmission line. We'd be replacing that third item there is more or less replacing a lot of the existing equipment, which is in the range of 60 years old. And then we'd add a salt solution, salt pump to help pump the salt to the existing softeners, to the softening process, electrical upgrades and miscellaneous building repairs. And I've got a question mark here at the end. Right now, you have 2 discharge permits for your water treatment plant, and there's a requirement there to look at dealing with some of that brine discharge that you have now because you're discharging to a small stream. So there is a requirement in the future in your permit to look at some alternatives on how to handle that water. So that's why there's a little bit of a question mark there, because that study hasn't been completed yet, hasn't been performed yet. The Beaver Hill, you'd have similar changes there. A little less changes in terms of the equipment because some of the equipment there is a little newer. Basically, you'd repair well leaks. You have some new well pumps, and again, a new aerator, softener, piping, and valve replacement. So we're kind of keeping the same kind of process that you have now. You're just mainly upgrading the equipment. And again, you have an NPS discharge permit there as well.
Carl, could I ask a question on
Sure.
where you have your question marks? Is that in part due to the fact that the aquifer itself is getting more salty, and so therefore these pumps are going to be discharging more salt into those little creeks, and the environmental assessment would?
Yes, it's related to that because when you run your softener, you run it for so many. Right now, you're running about 380,000 gallons through your softener in the forward position, going forward and treating the water, and then you have to stop and what they call regenerate the softener, and that's when you make this discharge. And so as the water gets salter, you have to do that regeneration more often. Right now, they require that for that NPDES discharge permit that you do what they call toxicity testing on the actual discharge, and that's where some of the problems have occurred with those tests, and so that's why they're requiring you to take a look at it in your next permit cycle, before your next permit cycle. But yes, so it's kind of indirect, but yes, as it gets saltier, you have to run that, and you will produce more discharge. This is a map of alternative 1. And it's basically the same as your existing system, except that you're adding a well up in this portion of the town. And as a background a little bit, some previous GMA studies have found that the water, where I'm kind of showing it here, the water from here that way is found to be a little fresher than the water going this way in the groundwater. So the reason we're picking a well up here, a location up here, is to look for some fresher water. And that would replace this Freemason well, which would be abandoned right here. But you would still be operating 2 water treatment plants. And so the primary difference would be this well up here, and then you're basically replacing a lot of the equipment in the other 2 water treatment plants. So that's alternative 1. It'll give you a water quality similar to what you have right now. The next alternative is to consolidate the two water treatment plants into one water treatment plant. And the idea here would be you decommission the Freemason water treatment plant and the well, and then you would expand the Beaver Hill water treatment plant. One of the reasons to consolidate a water treatment plant is to reduce the operating, well, first of all, you cut down on the amount of equipment, you cut down on the amount of maintenance because you're only running one treatment plant. You cut down on the amount of labor that you have to do also because you're cutting down and you're going to one treatment plant. So it affords some good advantages. The site location at Beaver Hill, there's more room there to expand as well. So that's why that particular location was chosen of the two plants. We'd still have a new water supply well because we're decommissioning the Freemason plant. You'd have new well pumps in the existing. The Virginia well is an older pump and an older pumping station, so it needs to have some work done on the building. Having trouble with my own eyes here. You need two new 10-inch transmission lines, and then again, you'd have a lot of replacement of the equipment in the Beaver Hill. You'd be combining the capacity from the Freemason with that, so you'd have a larger system, but in one spot. So you'd have a larger aerator. You'd have 3 softeners instead of one you have in each plant. Now you'd have new high service pumps, a new bleach system, and a new corrosion control system, which is the polyphosphate. And in this case, we're talking about a new ammonia feed system to make chloramines to help with the distribution system. The electrical control upgrades, a new water treatment plant building. You'd have a new finished water line to the Twitty tank. And we had to make an assumption here on this. We're talking about this MPDS discharge permit and that the evaluations have to be done on what to do with those discharges to help reduce the toxicity. And in this case, we basically assume we would be installing equalization tanks and a controlled discharge to the existing creeks. And like I said, here needs to be verified in future study to address the toxicity problem. This has a little more changes than the last alternative. Again, we would still be using a new well up here. We combine the flows from this well and the Virginia well, and basically they would go to the Freemason location as they do now, but we would, instead of treating in this plant, we'd pump it over to an expanded Beaver Hill plant over here. In addition, we would have to make a new transmission, a finished water transmission line over to the existing Twitty tank because we pump in more flow, so we need a bigger pipe to get over to the tank because we're pumping all the flow instead of about half of it. So that is a synopsis of what this alternative would be. And again, this would keep more or less keep your status quo water quality the way it is more or less right now. The third alternative, we're getting into the alternatives which will address the quality issues as well as the age of equipment and the other issues. In this one, we're looking at, there's basically 2 methods here. One is to try to find fresher wells, or in the next one I'll talk about, or treat the water with a reverse osmosis to try to actually remove the salt. So in this option, we're saying, well, let's find some cleaner wells to address this problem, and fresher wells will address the problem versus necessarily treating with a different technology. And then the next one I'll talk about says, well, no, let's not look for new wells, let's treat the water instead to remove the saltiness.
Carl, the first 2 alternatives really don't affect the quality of the water as it comes out.
Correct. It's more of a
3 and 4.
3 and 4 will address the quality. And it's a quality in terms of meeting the secondary treatment standards.
Yeah.
Now there's another thing that the RO, I'll get in, there's another benefit the RO has that I'll get into that in terms of water quality, but yeah, I think you've got it just right. So in this alternative, we would do 3 new water supply wells. And then you'd have a new well pump at the Beaver well would be like a backup well. So you'd have 3 main new fresh wells, and the Beaver Hill well would act as a backup. And you have some new transmission lines. Again, you have a lot of the same equipment that you would in alternative 2. You're just treating fresher wells. You're treating fresher water to start with now. Actually, the rest of it, the other thing that's a little different on this one, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button there. The other thing that's a little different is this Noose Waste regeneration line into Edenton Bay. Now, the reason for that is as you consolidate into one spot, you're going to be discharging more brine to the same little creek that you were before. So we made the assumption at this point, to be on the conservative side, that actually that would not be allowed by Diener, and we'd have to actually discharge the brine all the way down to Edenton Bay. And as you'll see on the next one, that's something you have to do for the RO plan as well. So they're similar in that respect. And then you decommission the Freemason, Virginia, and Boswell wells as part of this alternative. Looking at a picture of this one, or a schematic, excuse me, the 3 wells we locate on over here by Highway 17 and on the other side of it. We did this at the time we had a lot of discussion with John Norris on this, and we looked at some different locations, and these were found to be the optimal locations for this study. So what would happen here is you'd have to put in new raw water transmission lines and bring it back to the water treatment plant here. So you'd have 3 wells. They would pump all 3 to this well, and then there's the backup well would be the Beaver Hill well that's right next to it right now. And then again, you would have a transmission line to the Twitty tank, a new finished water, treated water transmission line and Twitty tank. And also included in this is a line here which is going to discharge down into Edenton Bay. So this is a schematic of our route to get the brine discharged down to Edenton Bay. Now, as you do have to get that permitted, and that process includes looking at a mixing study down here to determine, you do a study here of what the flows are in here, and then you do what they call a core mixing model. It's a technical term, but it basically looks at, okay, if we discharge X amount of water in here, how does that mix in the bay? How long does it take for that water to actually away from that discharge where it's actually the same as the bay water? Basically how it gets mixed in, it's called the mixing zone.
How does water get to Park Avenue?
It would be pumped through the same through the pumps over here. These pumps would be sized to pressurize the whole system. And this 12-inch line is a pretty good sized line to make it get over to that tank. So as part of design, we'd be looking at all that information and making sure that whatever we size here for these pumps, we'll get it over to there too. It has to get it through the whole distribution system anyhow, so that wouldn't be a problem. The fourth alternative is you could consolidate again at Beaver Hill plant, and then we're going to use what we call reverse osmosis treatment. And what that treatment does is the reverse osmosis system takes that water that's kind of salty and it pushes it through a membrane, a thin membrane. It's a very thin membrane. It's much smaller than the hairs on your head, and it will force the water, the fresh water in the middle of it, and then it takes off that fresh water, and then you use that to supply your system. So it's kind of it's somewhat of a filter, but it's a lot smaller filter. It can actually filter stuff down to the ion level. In this alternative, we'd have new pumps in the existing wells, and one of the things about that is when you use reverse osmosis, you have to actually pump more water to the water treatment plants, because some of that water is being concentrated and it's going to Edenton Bay. You have to have a little bit higher pumping rate, and that's why we would put new pumps in the existing wells. We'd have a new 10-inch raw transmission line. The treatment system itself would consist of pretreatment and two are what they call RO skids. They usually come as skid-mounted units. At the very end of this presentation, I'll let you see what that looks like. But that's what we'd be putting in. We'd have a bypass treatment system. At the beginning, what you're doing right now is you're already bypassing around your softeners, because if you think about it in terms of the softener, it takes all the hardness out, and you want to have a little hardness in your water in your distribution system. So you do a bypass right now. Well, the reverse osmosis takes even more things out of the water. So you'd have a bypass around, and you bypass the raw water around and mix it with the treated water, so you get a blended water after the units that you're going to distribute out. You'd have a new sodium hypochlorite is really bleach. You have a new bleach, and polyphosphate, just think of that as corrosion control systems. You'd have final pH adjustment, and in most reverse osmosis plants, you want to have kind of a set operating time. It's nice to operate them for a long time period, and what helps with that is to have a finished water storage tank after the process. That way you can run it for a while, no matter what the demand's doing in the system, if it's going up or down, you can run that RO unit at more of a steady rate. So that's why we would have those in there. And then you'd have new finished water pumps. So you'd have well pumps that would pump it to the RO system. It would go through the RO system to a storage tank, and then you would pump from the storage tank into your distribution system. Again, we'd have some electrical upgrades, and we'd have a new water treatment plant building at Beaver Hill. There'd be a new finished water line to the Twitty tank. And again, we would be discharging it, what they call, actually this is a misnomer here, it's a concentrate discharge to Edenton Bay. The thing that's important here too to recognize is that with the reverse osmosis system, Diener does want you to do some pilot testing. Now, for your system, you could actually set up a pilot at one of the two existing treatment plants right now, and you could run that pilot, as part of that, just divert some water over and run a pilot plant at one of your existing plants right now. And then, as is the same with the other alternative, you have to do this mixing study in Edenton Bay to get approval to discharge there.
So, no new pumps at all? I mean, no new wells at all, excuse me.
Yeah, you wouldn't have any new wells, but you'd have new pumps in the wells, because with an RO system, not only will we have more that we have to pump, but you also want to have stainless steel pumps. You want to have more durable materials and materials that won't corrode, because the RO system is sensitive to iron and to iron that might come off if you had some corrosion, so you don't want to have that happen in your wells. The other thing about that, though, is in order to verify that we can use all the existing wells, there would be a requirement to do some pumping tests of the existing wells to see what happens when you try to pump it a little more. What happens now is when you pump it higher, you pull more salt in. It tends to do that, and that's one of the reasons Freemason well isn't used quite as much as you're kind of backing off on your pumping rates versus what you potentially could because of this water quality problem. When you put the reverse osmosis in, the idea would be that you could increase that pumping rate, and even if you get more salt, it doesn't matter as much because you have the treatment system to take it out. So, but it would require some pump testing to make sure that you could increase the pumping rate enough to feed the plant.
Does that have a high degree or a reasonable degree of flexibility of increased population beyond what your projections were? When you started, it seemed like a very minimal increase, and of course we have high expectations.
High hopes. Yeah, we're designing these for a 1.2 MGD, which is your maximum daily demand. So it should, with that combined with your storage in the system, should allow some additional growth that should accommodate some of that. It depends on how much you're talking about in the end, but we can always.
That would be the grand question.
Right. Now we can design the treatment plants, especially in these 3 and 4, to be expandable, so if you need to, you could add units later. It's kind of a stepwise process.
That's part of my question.
It's a stepwise process.
But they're the most expensive of the four. This is the most expensive.
Actually, the alternative 3 actually had a higher capital cost than this one. Because you're still, and I'll get to that, there's a cost table that's coming up, but these two alternatives where you're treating to a higher degree or getting water of a higher quality are more expensive than the other two for sure, if you're keeping with the status quo right now. So in this alternative, you'd use the existing wells, but you'd have to still bring the water over from the Freemason over to here, and you'd still have the same water transmission line here. And as we were looking at before, you'd have to still discharge the brine, well, it's actually, in this case, it's called the RO concentrate, down into the bay here. You wanted to get a chance to look, we did some preliminary cost estimates.
Yeah.
These are probably good within about plus or minus 10 to 15%. And as you can see here, the alternatives 1 and 2 are lower costs than the other two. 3 is a little bit more costly than 4. In this, about $500,000 more, and that's a lot to do with transmission lines and doing the test wells and installing those 3 new wells. Yes.
Which one of the 4 would you suggest to the town to go for?
But it just lead me into everything here, aren't they? You guys are just a step ahead of me all the way here. Well, I guess I can, these are some of the non-monetary comments, but in essence, it depends on what the town wants to do. If they want to stay with the status quo and keep the existing water quality, then we're recommending alternative 2, and I'll get into why. And then if you want to increase the water quality and meet those secondary standards, then we would be recommending alternative 4, which is the reverse osmosis. So this is a little bit of a non-monetary comparison, so you can get a feel for what the differences are between them from a non-monetary perspective. The main thing, I think I've kind of covered some of it already, is that with alternatives 1 and 2, you're not really addressing any of the saltiness issue, either now or in the future. The intrusion into the aquifer could continue to get worse, and those two wouldn't address that at all. There's a number of other ideas in here, but in a crux, the last 3 alternatives, 2, 3, and 4, are consolidating both of your existing plants into one plant. So that's another pretty big difference between that and keeping with your 2 plants right now. And as I mentioned before, some of the advantages of that are if you consolidate into one plant, you only have 1 NPDES discharge permit to worry about now. You only have 1 set of equipment and maintenance to do, and the operators only have to go and deal with 1 plant versus operating 2 different plants. And it goes to actually since there's 2 buildings which are over 50 years old now, if you consolidate it to 1 plant, you'd have half the buildings to also maintain as well. In terms of alternatives 3 and 4, in essence, anytime you look for a new well, you have to do these test wells, and you don't know whether that well is going to produce what you need to produce. And Gary kind of alluded to that earlier. Is if in the first two alternatives you're looking to find 1 new well, and then in the third alternative you're looking to find 3 new wells. So you may go out and do test wells, and you may get it on the first shot, or you may not. So there's a little bit of uncertainty there on the cost in terms of, well, how many times are we going to have to go out and drill and find good wells? And we may drill 3 and get 3 wells, you may luck out and get it right away, or you may have to drill 5 test wells to get 3 wells, or to get the quality or the quantity that you want out of the wells. In the last alternative, the RO alternative, you don't necessarily have that kind of cost involved with it. In both 3 and 4, you're going to have to discharge a brine or a RO concentrate somewhere. You're going to have a waste stream to get rid of. That's going to be a higher flow. And in terms of the benefits for the RO, what you have here, oops, could I learn how to hit this red button instead of the other ones? Basically, the RO will, if you go with the RO in the future, say the saltwater intrusion continues and the wells get saltier over time, well, we can design that into the RO system. We can look ahead and say, well, we know what the saltiness is now. We're going to look ahead and say, well, maybe it's going to increase 2% a year or something. We can design that in when we're doing the actual design, and so that if the saltwater intrusion continues, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to necessarily do anything about it because you're already treating the saltiness out of the water.
Payment now, payment later.
Yeah, it's kind of like, if you went and you got fresher wells, if they're deteriorated over time, then you may have to take another step. So that's one of the reasons we think alternative 4 is a good one. There's also these things, you may have heard of them, trihalo THMs is what they're called, and they're basically chlorinated byproducts. And those chlorinated byproducts can be, when you add chlorine to your water, if there's any organic matter in the water, if there's bromides or bromide in the water, it can make these things called THMs. And right now you're having some of that happening at the moment at each of your plants. The RO system will be pretty effective in taking out what forms these things with the chlorine in the first place. So you kind of do preventative. It's going to take this stuff out, and when the chlorine hits, it never really sees it. The other thing with RO is when you do reverse osmosis, the water that comes out, generally all the bacteria are strained out by the membranes as well. So you don't have as high a chlorine demand. You don't have to add as much chlorine. So you kind of address the THMs that way too. You don't even have to add as much chlorine. I think that kind of sums up that. So what are our recommendations? As I mentioned before, would be alternative 4 if you're going to want to go for if you want to attain the higher water quality. And here's some reasons up here. The RO quality is a little more consistent than softening over time. Softening takes out the hardness, but it's also can be affected by iron and some other constituents. So when you produce water with a reverse osmosis plant, it's just the same water coming out all the time. When you do a softener, as the softener gets loaded up, the water quality kind of tails off, and then you got to regenerate it. So where it's like new again, where it has the best quality. So it kind of the water quality goes up and down a little bit. You can remove these precursors I was talking about. I talked a little bit about test wells, that you have to do more of a search. And in terms of alternative 3 and 4, because of the volume of the brine, one of the disadvantages of RO, stated is that you have to find a place to discharge the RO concentrate, but you're going to have to do the same thing with your brine from your softening system anyhow, so it's not much difference there. And as I mentioned before, saltwater intrusion problems won't be it's not so sensitive to it, the RO. Some of the things I think that is important, though, one of the things we found when we looked at the data from the existing raw water wells is that there's a pretty variable iron content, and these RO systems are pretty sensitive to iron. You can add some chemicals to kind of keep them in solution, but I think it'd be very beneficial to take more samples at the wells and test them for iron, both total iron, which includes all the particles of iron, and then dissolved iron, which is when you strain out all the particles, and that gives us more information in terms of evaluating this alternative. And then, as I said before, you have to perform mixing studies, a pilot test, and pump tests on the existing wells. If you want to stay with the status quo water quality, we recommended alternative 2, and a lot of this has to do with simplifying the operation and consolidating into one treatment plant, as I mentioned before. It'll reduce the long-term building, equipment maintenance, and because the Beaver Hill land area, you have more land area over there, it'd be easier to expand in the future. If you kept with 2 separate plants, there's not much room at all to expand at the Freemason plant. So you'd be kind of in a pickle at that point. I just want to go quickly over some RO, just some quick stuff about it, not get into too much detail, but this gives you a gradation of different kinds of treatment. But reverse osmosis, you're taking out really small particles. Your human hair is over here on the far right side. That's a human hair. over here you're getting some really small stuff. You got viruses, carbon blacks, bacteria is taken out here. So with the reverse osmosis, you actually are taking out ionic sized particles. So it really cleans up the water well, but you're way in the small end of things. It's a lot more fine than just regular filtration. And this kind of shows you what reverse osmosis is. Normally in osmosis, there's osmotic pressure that builds up, and the fresh water wants to go and dilute out the salt water. What you do is you apply pressure with pumps onto a membrane and you force it the other way. So you're producing fresh water. And this here kind of gives you an idea of how things are knocked out from this membrane. This is a membrane. This is your feed water coming in from the wells, and your product water will come out down here. So these are bouncing off. It's kind of a schematic showing all these things that do not get through that membrane. Now in our case, though, remember we're going to bypass some of the raw water to bring back some minerals back into the water, because this basically demineralizes water. It's almost like deionized water. So what this does, it takes all the most of the ions out, and you want to restore some of those because you want to have a certain amount of hardness and calcium and alkalinity in the water. All right, last slide. This is a typical RO unit. We're actually doing a pilot for another community right now in terms of an RO plant, so we're pretty familiar with them. What happens is you get water that they call these spiral wound because they're like kind of a paper. If you think of a paper towel roll, they're kind of wound around, and what happens is the water is pushed from the outside, and the fresh water comes out this pipe in the middle. So all the water is kind of coming in from around and going into the center. And then what they look like is right here is they come skid mounted like this. Now this isn't necessarily the exact same model you'd have, but this gives you an idea. There's water coming out, the fresh water is coming out of the center of these, and then you feed in the raw water into the outside part of them, and then you have these vessels like this. And you typically have a control panel here which controls the whole process. So. But that's just to give you a quick idea what these things look like and what they're about.
And one that size would treat how much water? I guess you do it gallons per minute or gallons?
Yeah, they rate them on MGD, and I'll have to be 100% honest, I don't know the exact amount on that one right there.
Does the osmosis approach reduce the opportunity for expansion? I'm not making good, I don't know exactly how to ask that question. But I've been through this osmosis thing once.
Okay.
And it really improved the water. But it was a concern about population.
The ability to expand it, in other words?
Yeah.
Yeah, what you can do is you can have these skid-mounted ones made, they're basically made to size.
Well, I understand.
And then you can add more as you go.
Yeah, that you just have to keep adding the RO units.
Right, if you get above your demand, if it can't meet your demand, you would need to do that eventually, but.
Investments cost a whole lot more on these.
There's chemical usage on these. You have to add the anti-scalant at the beginning of it, and typically you'll add some pH adjustment at the end of it. So and there's more energy use, but from a pure labor standpoint, a lot of times it's less labor because they're pretty much automated, and you run the water through them, and the water comes out and the concentrate comes out. There's not a whole lot of adjustments once you kind of get fine-tuned onto it, but you will need to add a chemical, and maybe one or two chemicals up front of this thing. There's also what they call a cartridge filter in front of these. So they have a small filter, it's a 5 micron, which is a really small filter, ahead of this to try to keep any particles. The main problem you're going to have with these, if you have any, is plugging, because they're so fine. It's like a filter at home if you plug a filter at home. But what you'd have in front of these would be what they call a cartridge filter. Then you typically add an anti-scalant, what they call it, to keep things from precipitating inside there. And then on the other end, because what happens is the pH tends to drop through these things, through the RO process. It tends to drop because you're taking things out of the water, and it makes it a little bit more acidic. I mean, not a lot, but it drops the pH some, and you typically will add some kind of caustic or other solution at the end. Yeah. So hopefully this all made sense. Are there any other questions, or?
Well, stay right where you are, because I don't know if y'all have already dealt with this or not, but at one time we were talking about a regional RO system. Did that just not pan out at all, or? I don't know if y'all work one or not, so that's the reason I'm bringing it up at the same time.
We initiated, or we asked through the Albemarle Commission back when we were doing the original work with the Wooten Company and the GMA about that possibility, and we didn't get much traction. But I was going to ask Gary and Bucky and Carl. I know the General Assembly, with the budget bill that was passed, I keep hearing that there was language in there mandating that local government water systems study regional options, but haven't got much clarification on what that means.
Yeah, there are two pieces of that, Anne Marie. One of them requires DEQ to study, this is for the Division of Environmental Quality, the old DENR, to study consolidation possibilities for water systems in the same river basins without causing an interbasin transfer. Now, there's a separate piece of it where they have set aside state appropriations that will allow applicants to apply for funds to study for regionalization efforts, such as this, if you were to go in with another water utility and study bringing those two systems together, either under common treatment and supply or distribution. Now, the details of those are grants. Those details have not come out yet. That is the State Water Infrastructure Authority will be reviewing that during the months of December and January. So we expect February sometime, maybe March, to have some guidelines on what those regionalization grants will look like.
And just to follow up that, I have had very preliminary conversation with the county manager. I let Kevin know that we were receiving this report and that I wanted to share it with him and their engineers, because they're looking at a lot of things with their water system, and maybe now would be an appropriate time for us to sit down and talk about ways that we might work together.
I have a question. Staying on the regional thought, how many counties north of here on the same side of the sound draw from the same aquifer? Because, I mean, it seems to me if you got a mixed raw situation, you can't run one of those. You'd have to run one for each raw source, or is that wrong? I mean, can you blend? Well, wait a minute, let me get my first question answered first. Do we all draw out of the same aquifer?
There are several aquifers, and I'm not sure where everybody draws from. I would
Okay.
assume that they draw, some municipalities or local units draw from multiple aquifers within the same system. So I would say throughout, the folks who are north of the Sound, they're probably looking at several different confined aquifers.
But that wouldn't necessarily complicate running a reverse osmosis machine for a region.
You'd have to look at, you'd have to do a study on get data on the water quality from each of the wells that from each of the communities that are interested in joining together.
Okay.
And the reason I was asking the regional thing was I know our friends over in Martin County have just spent a boatload of money. And when I say a boatload, I mean $30–40 million of trying to have drinking water for their citizens. I mean, just because their aquifers were not as I mean, they were drying up in places, and they were just having a heck of a time. I want us to stay ahead of that game. I mean, $6 million, I think is what your number was. $6,400,000. That's a lot of money, but it's
Right.
not $38 million. You know?
No, it's not 38.
Well, their demand is much bigger too.
Yeah, it's all pretty specific on, where you're at in terms of your cost. But yeah, the demands would have been larger for that.
If I might,
Well, yeah.
I just wanted to say, I wanted to thank Carl and Gary and Bucky too, but working on this study, you can tell that Carl has a terrific command of his subject, and it's a complicated subject, but I thought he did a fine job laying out and walking us through what the options are. And the next, we talked about what the next steps are, and immediately, the most pressing thing is really just in order to satisfy one of the conditions of the grant that funded the report, is that we would ask that the council at your next regular meeting will prepare a resolution where you formally acknowledge that you've received the report, you've had a presentation, and then we can close out the grant report. And I've asked Carl and Gary if they'll schedule some time with us after the first of the year and sit down and really talk about how we might plan a path forward for you all to give us some sense of direction as to which path you think you want to go down, and then work with Chowan County and talk with them about some options for studying opportunities.
I think it
Well-
would make perfect sense for us to join in with the county in this, because they're going to be facing the same type problems, same type situation. So it looks to me like it would be feasible to do that with both town and county.
They pull from a different aquifer. They pull from the Yorktown aquifer, so they have some different issues than what we have, but still, I think, we've talked over the years and the timing has never quite been right, but it just seems like right now with what they're dealing with, we really need to sit down and review all that together.
Well, I think the fact of salt infiltration is going to be a continuing factor, and all indications based on the past, it's going to continue at probably a higher rate. So it's a subject that has to be faced, unfortunately, and it's a very expensive one. But thank you very much for your time and being here.
Well, thank you all for
Very much
listening.
appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Is that grant still through the Rural Center, or was it moved over to the Rural Development?
I think it has moved over to Commerce.
Yeah, Rural Development.
Yeah, it's all in commerce.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank y'all,
Thanks
guys.
for coming.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Carl.
Mayor, we've got one more on the Utilities Committee. It's an occupancy license agreement. It's brought about from the need for the water line to run from Jumbo Jumbo's. It's going to be crossing the railroad, which is a Chesapeake and Albemarle system. And there's rather lengthy and contained agreement which is required for us to review. And now, whether or not we need to take action on this this evening.
You need, well, we're asking that your committee consider recommending it to go on the
Yes.
agenda for December 8th.
I think that, I'm sure everybody's read it very carefully. So I am suggesting and recommending that we take it to the commission. Now I'll put that in the form of a motion.
Don't need it. You just
Just do it.
send it on.
Well, let's do it.
Expediency.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you, sir. Next committee to meet and report tonight is our administrative committee, and that's chaired by Councilman Steve Biggs. Please, sir.
Mayor, we've got two items on the agenda tonight, and the first one is the proposed covenants and operation plan for the former Northeast Commission building, like we hadn't heard this before. But won't keep everybody just kind of moving along on this. In your packet tonight for the administrative committee, you have what is the proposed covenants that Anne Marie has kind of sort of found. And below that, you also have some of the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, standards for preservation, preservation as a treatment, standards for rehabilitation, and so on. And, you know, there's a lot of standards for restoration. There's a lot of rehab quotes here. And to be real honest with you, there's a lot of it that, as I was telling Anne Marie earlier, I mean, I think I can read and understand a lot of things, but there's a lot of this that I'm not sure that I totally understand. So I told the mayor earlier tonight that we were going to try our best to move along with this. You saw his email since we had these covenants and operation plan. One thing we need to decide, and I think there's a little bit of confusion, I know there was earlier when Anne Marie and Councilman Stallings and I were talking, about what we're actually going to do with this building. So one thing that I want to propose that we put on for the regular meeting, because tonight's not the night to discuss it, to be real honest, because it needs to be discussed by the full board, is whether we're going to sell this building or lease this building. We, at one time, said we were going to sell it. We had the appraisal done on it. Then we came back, and again, we were confused, even amongst the three of us earlier, as to what we're going to do with this building. So that's number one that I'd like for us to put on the agenda for everybody to think about. Now, number two is I'm going to ask, instead of us recommending what these, all these standards for preservation and everything here is, I'd like to ask that Reed Thomas be at our next meeting, if at all possible, so that we can ask questions of him. Because if I read this correctly, neither one of the proposed proposals, that we have, could go in that building.
Or what?
Could not go in that building. Either one of them, if we strictly go by this. Because one of them is going to want to raise the roof, but it can't do that, if I understand this correctly. One of them is going to want to do something with the back building that has the big garage doors. You can't do anything with that, if I read this correctly. And maybe somebody has read it different than I've read it. And I don't want to keep putting this off. We need to decide what we're going to do, if we're going to stay with those two proposals, if we're going to lease it. I think we ought to send it out to other companies. I hate the idea of starting all over again, but if that's what we got to do to get it right, I don't have a problem with that. And so that's my proposal for tonight, my proposal. Now, I don't know if my committee members are going to agree with that, to send it under those conditions. But if not, I'll entertain anything that they've got to say as to how we send this on, because I don't think it's right that the three of us should have to sit up here and continue on just, wasting time with this.
Me personally,
Yes, sir.
I agree with what you said.
Okay?
Let's do it that way and send it on and get it out. Get it over.
Okay?
I'm along with you all with that.
Okay, so at our next meeting, we will have Mr. Thomas here, hopefully, and
And also Claudia.
Claudia can
Claudia could
answer.
set her covenants. I mean, she would hold them. Her organization would hold the covenants.
I don't mind Claudia being here, but I want Reed's.
Yeah, I understand.
I want somebody who's going to explain this to tell me what you can and cannot do on a state level.
Absolutely, but what I'm saying is the covenants are actually held by Preservation North Carolina, which Reed doesn't work for.
Oh, I understand that.
Okay.
Totally
So, I mean,
understand
I
that.
think that they need to be there to comment too.
And
Because if somebody wanted to move the doors, they wouldn't ask Reed, they'd ask.
And I'm not so sure if we own this building now that we have to have Preservation North Carolina hold these
No,
covenants.
we have to have somebody.
Why can't we do it?
Well, I guess we could. We're not in the
I
business
think
of
it
cov-
would,
yeah, we're not in the
I mean,
business
we own the building, we
Yeah.
ought to be able to do that.
Well,
gonna
anybody
sell it.
can do it. It's just, we don't administer covenants, so.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I'm not, well, it does, but I'm not so sure I'm gonna agree with that.
And the person that makes the final decision would be the Park Service about, it'd be, the only time the covenants would come into effect, if you have a group that would enforce the covenants, and then you have a group that would, the Secretary of Interior standards come into effect. If you violate those, you don't get tax credits, and they're two different tracks. But I mean, Reed's a person, I mean, he can explain it perfectly, so.
But as it sits right now, we own that building, and if we're gonna put covenants on it, we ought to be able to be the ones that decide, yeah, you can kind of skim that a little bit, or no, you can't skim that a little bit.
Well, I mean, as far as we can do that, but then the Park Service would pick it up on tax credit end.
Okay,
And that would be they have to follow the Secretary of Interior standards in order to get tax credits, which both of them won't.
Well, you've got the same problem with the proposed operation agreement. I mean,
We would
Wait.
administer that. I mean, that would be us. That wouldn't be somebody
I
else.
agree, but these are points that have been posed, but none of them are like, here are the operational conditions, or these are the agreements that you have to make to be in that position. Again, it's like hours of operation, and I know that we don't pose hours of operation on any business here in town. People, it's a private business. But we have a preference. And
We do impose some hour, like Pembroke Hall can't have music after 10. I mean, that's.
Well, yes, and that's where part of this came from, and I'm sure. And I have to mention, again, noise. Unfortunately, this building is in a peculiar spot. It's in a park, and the conditions that it would fall under are I think, affected by it being in a park. Trash removal. I can't for the life of me personally figure that one out. So, I mean, there are going to be all sorts of operational things like this that this committee is going to have to be looking at, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir, and we will. I do want to make sure that everyone happened to see the petition that came about from the very close neighbors, as you'll see on
Yes.
the.
That's the neighbors right down the street.
That's the neighbors that are pretty much abutting the property,
That's right.
and I want to make sure that you saw it. Okay, we will send that on that way. Thank you much. The other item we have tonight is boards and commissions from the Recreation Advisory Board, or for the Recreation Advisory Board, and we had two that we did find out that they are eligible to be reappointed, and Anne Marie is going to find out if they would like to be reappointed before our next meeting. So we will send that on. If they would like to be, then, you know, we'll have the opportunity to talk about that at the regular council meeting. Is that all right with you, Commissioner Bond and Commissioner Simpson?
Yes, sir.
Sounds perfect.
All right, good deal. We're through, Mayor. Thank you.
All right. Finance Committee, tax reliefs and pickups.
I don't think I'll get any opposition. I'd like to send this to the consent agenda.
You got it.
Great idea.
It's a good approach.
That'll be all over.
Okay, and that completes our agenda for this evening. I have a question regarding the recommendation just made, Steve, by your committee relative to the covenants and the operations, and are you requesting that that be held in committee meeting, the next committee meeting, or is this something that we're going? I personally don't like to do detailed. We could open up as a committee of the whole and everybody talk about the terms and conditions with Reed in the room and Claudia. As your moderator, I don't like to have committee meetings at a policy meeting, unless there's no other way to do it. But because we have other items on those agendas, but I mean, that's, Anne Marie, is there any precedent or hard and fast? There isn't. So, I mean, what's your intent? To do it at the town council meeting in early December?
Well,
Or
as
whenever we can get, I guess it's contingent on whenever we can get Reed over here as well.
as I had stated earlier tonight, again, before the meeting when it was just general conversation, you know, these don't really end up being committee meetings. This particular committee consists of myself and Councilman Bond and Councilwoman Simpson. And we have tried to open it up so that everyone can have a say during the committee meeting at each point in time. And it ends up we don't get any further.
Yeah.
So if it's going to be a full council meeting sitting behind this desk at a committee meeting, we might as well have a full committee meeting at the council meeting.
And I just, can I add one thing?
Sure.
If we hold the covenants, it is not nearly as much protection as if some third, we decide what we want, we give it to a third party. Then in 5 years, somebody can come back before this board and say, I want to change it, let them raise, I think it offers the residents a much more protection than if we own them, because then we might all be gone and somebody else can just, with one vote, flip it out, to something totally different. I mean, which is fine, but I mean, that's the value of having a statewide nonprofit do it that doesn't change its covenants and doesn't react to what political winds are. But, you know, I mean, I don't really, it doesn't really matter to me one way or the other. Both of them will have to get credits. And so, if you get a credit, the guy can't raise the roof. I mean, you know, that's the bottom line. If he doesn't want a credit, then he can.
Well, but, I'll talk about that one.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, since we're already out of that,
Yeah.
we've gone through the
I didn't mean
finance
to do
committee,
that,
the whole
But
works.
anyway, that's,
Well, you're gonna have the same, I hate to keep mentioning, but the operational things that fall in that category. You can't help
Exactly.
it. And
So why
we
does
can
one
make
and the
all
other
the
one not?
decisions we want, but we only got two proposals.
Mayor, can I ask a question, just to make sure I get it right for the agenda?
Please.
Okay, Steve, you asked for two things to be on the regular agenda. One was, are we going to sell or are we going to lease the building? So that would be a discussion and a question, and there'd be some sort of action
a vote,
taken
yes,
on that.
yes,
And then the
and-
second one was.
And/or both, excuse me.
And or both, either,
Right.
right. And the second action item is to have Reed and hopefully Claudia to be able to explain the covenants, and you all ask questions, but there's no other action item.
And I
Those
don't, I
two.
mean, I think it'll be up to the council that night to decide whether we want to go ahead and move forward with them with the public hearing.
yeah, I think
But
that's.
again, you know, there's operational procedures that's got to go along with this, so.
May I ask one
Sure.
thing of that? Perhaps it's, as I hear our town manager, you asked the question of Councilman Biggs concerning the question that would be on the agenda. And the question, which I would assume would be the first question asked, are we going to lease or sell? Well, it's my understanding, that both of the proposals have come back and said they are not interested in leasing.
Correct.
That's correct.
So what's the question? Then if we're going to
The
discuss
question
these
is, we're going to
proposals.
decide whether we're going to lease it or whether we're going to sell it. Now, we've talked about selling, we've talked about it.
If we
but
decide
we've
we're gonna
talked-
lease it, then we're gonna.
That's right, we can go
put out
out.
a new proposal for people to lease it.
Absolutely.
If it
Well,
just-
it's going to have to go beyond, that takes you to the point of, are we going to reissue the program?
Yes.
Absolutely.
correct.
And that's,
That's correct.
all right.
One of the two. I said one of the two. We're either going to decide, yes, we will consider leasing it, or we won't consider leasing it. We're just going to sell it and be done with it.
And then we have a public hearing. I mean, I think having the public hearing, if we decide we are gonna sell it, or, you know, I guess with leasing it, we
Now,
wouldn't have one.
all right, on the point of the public hearing, my understanding initially was that the public would comment on what we do with the building, sell or lease. The public input as to what covenants and what hours of operation, and I don't think that's part of the public hearing. Am I right or wrong?
What I thought we do is decide, you know, sell or lease. If we decide to sell, we go ahead and have a public hearing, let everybody come in and tell us all their thoughts about it.
Right?
And then we gather that information, and then, you know, we can craft, we can then go back to the people that are looking at these buildings and say, you know, here are our concerns we hear from the public. How are you gonna meet those concerns? And then we craft out covenants and use restrictions based on what we hear, and then we pass it, and, you know, decide which one we want and pass it.
I
That's kind
agree.
of my idea, but I don't know whether that's right.
All right, so given that scenario, you could have the public hearing before you get in the weeds on
Yeah.
covenant.
And I would think you'd want to.
Because they would add to the process of making those determinations. So the idea of getting covenants and then public hearing, to me, is not the right way to go. The idea of having a public hearing, and that's one of the reasons I was trying to express myself over the weekend, if we get the public input, then we can add that to what has already been suggested to us by staff, and now it will be supplemented and complemented by further conversation with Reed and Claudia, then we will have it all. I mean, sequentially, does that not make sense?
I think we gotta hear from the
Well, you're gonna-
and everything that are
but
gonna tell us what they want done.
Councilman Dixon, the question is, really, Mayor, I just heard you say, I think, that we would have a public hearing over the covenants and so forth, but why have a public hearing on the covenants?
No, I don't want to have one on the covenant. I want one on the building.
Okay,
And the
but are we
input that they would
saying
like for
that
us.
we're going to have a public hearing on whether we're going to sell the building or lease the building?
And suggestions they have relative to who we sell it to and how it's operated.
Can I jump back in one more question?
Yeah.
Okay, what I thought I heard Steve say, which makes a whole lot of sense, is next week, we decide whether we're gonna sell or lease. I would
Right.
think if we decide we're gonna sell, we go ahead and have a public hearing. I would
That's
think
where I was
if-
coming
if
from.
if we decide
I
we're gonna
agree.
lease, then we
You know
put
what I
out
said?
another request for proposals. And then, because we gotta start all over if we decide we're gonna lease.
It
And
might have been your
and then we-
intent, that's
We
not
might
what I
not get
heard.
it, you know, we can decide,
Whatever.
we gotta decide what we're gonna rent it for and all that. We put out a proposal, we might get 100 people, we might get 0. So, I mean, I think the decision we gotta make is to sell or lease first.
But is that our decision? That's back to that, or were you going
But
to
don't you
have
think you
a-
need to hear
Wait a
from the
minute.
public?
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, go right ahead.
I just want to finish this sentence.
Huh.
Back to the public hearing. Were we going to have, what were we going to have a public hearing on?
Selling,
That's a question.
selling the building. All you have right now, unless you change your mind and want to go out to the market again, all you have right now are 2 proposals to buy. No lease.
Right.
So we do the buy lease vote, and then that leaves you back with just the 2 parties. And then my idea was we get, at that point, comment from the public, and then bring in the experts on the covenants, and we'd add the public's comments and mesh them in with what the expert advice is. If we try to do the covenants and then bring in
No, I'm
the public,
with you.
I
I'm with
think
you.
that's
I'm with you.
the wrong order, but it's
But
just my opinion.
is the name of this public hearing what?
On the sale and use of the Congress
Sale or
slash,
lease of the building?
sale
is
and
it?
use.
Sale and use, for use.
I don't know,
Sale
you,
or lease.
no lease, unless you start over. We're gonna have that vote second Tuesday in December.
Just by the council.
That's all we have. That's all we can vote on.
Yeah.
The way it was put forward.
Well, I just want to, I'm trying really hard to make sure that I comprehend this thing. It's quite complicated. So the next meeting, we're going to vote on whether we sell or lease.
That's it.
Can I speak now?
Mm.
I think the public hearing needs to be done before we make the decision. I personally think we need to hear the public input before we make a decision whether we sell or lease. May not sway the opinion at all,
I'll go
but
along
I
with
just
that, too.
think we need to hear, that's just one man's opinion.
It's a good opinion.
I don't have-
That's different than, you know, than.
Do you agree or disagree with that?
Well, we have already decided to sell the building. We sat up here and said, we're going to sell that building, and we voted to sell that building.
We sent out to the market.
That we were selling the building. We had an appraisal done. But I know sometimes I'm crazy, and I realize that. But I know I'm not crazy enough that I don't remember we sat up here within the last 2 meetings and talked about, wait a minute, maybe we need to lease this building,
We did talk about that,
okay?
but we didn't make a decision to do that.
But No, we didn't. You're exactly right. So we have actually made the decision already to sell the building.
What we did is we went back and asked the people that were interested if they wanted to lease.
Well, here's the thing.
Leasing, and they said no.
You've only got one person that wants to buy the building.
Yeah, the other one wants you to
The
give.
other one wants you to give it to them.
Yeah, that is-
And I promise you, Jimmy Stallings will not vote to give the man the building.
I'm with you. I agree.
All right, so how do we get to the December meeting? We're good to go right now. We're gonna have a public, we're gonna vote for the record that the building is for sale. And if that vote,
Or lease.
if that vote fails, and then, yeah, or lease, we'll call for a vote to sell, call for a vote for the lease. Majority of the votes sets the course of what is to be done with the building. Right? Then you can go to covenants and public hearings, or public hearings and covenants. I personally think the public needs to be heard before we sit up here and try to figure out what to do with it. That would make it more inclusive to get expert outside opinion plus public opinion, then set, I don't know.
And I don't have a problem at all with that either. As a matter of fact, it's probably is the best way to go. So if you want to have Reed come when we have our public hearing, do you want to have the public hearing before you have the, and we can't say one don't have something to do with the other. Do you want to have the public hearing before you get the report back from your sailing group? Because that does have something to do with that building. That's where they're at right now.
Yeah.
That group's moving along great.
They are
by the
moving
way.
along.
That
And I
was-
appreciate them doing
That's
that.
been a wonderful group.
So which way do you want to do that?
Well, they're gonna be ready in January.
Yeah, we don't have to wait on them very long. By
Good.
the time we advertise the public hearing, they're gonna be ready to roll.
Well, sure isn't anything that doesn't say when you get ready to vote, you can say, you know what, let's table this. It's happened before. I've been here long enough to know that's happened before.
Okay. We could have gotten up and walked away from here 15 minutes ago if I hadn't asked that question.
I had already texted home and said I'm coming.
You got any thoughts on that?
I still
Madam
need
Manager.
clarification. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if you want to just, are you asking for anything on the December meeting, or do you want to wait and get the sailing group's report, which we've set a goal. I think they'll be ready by your meeting in.
Say that again, Anne Marie, I'm sorry.
The sailing kayaking,
I thought that was going to be in January.
it is.
Okay.
So, but do you want to make a decision on lease or sell? But then I'm hearing, well, maybe you ought to have a public hearing before you decide on lease or sell, but then you don't want to have the public hearing before you get the report from the sailing group.
And
So,
other things too.
so that leaves us with waiting on the sailing committee report, which hopefully will be, I think your meeting is like January 12th. I think they're going to try like the Dickens to be ready for January 12th. So you get that report then, that night, and then you can decide when do you want to have the public hearing. I'm just wondering if there's any action item for you to take next Tuesday night, or December 8th.
Well, you have to wonder, would the report from the sailing committee have any effect on sell
Sure it does.
or lease?
Sure it does.
Well,
Absolutely.
of course it does, but we don't get that till January 12th.
All right, hold on one second. I'm going back to my committee members. How about we wait until January? We'll talk about,
Yes, yes.
you good with that?
Yes.
You good with that?
Yes,
We'll wait till January. And we are finished this time.
Yeah, we are done.
Well, our committee is.